Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Eco Justice Radio acknowledges we record the show on the traditional territory of the Tongva and all of their relatives. Welcome, I am Jack Eidt. On today's show, 15-Minute Cities, an urbanist revolution facing challenges. We air discussions from different voices: Professor Carlos Moreno, scientist Angel Su, the Urbanity YouTube channel, and urbanist Brett Todderin on the big idea of making our cities human-centered and the challenges we face in making that come to a fruition. First, we start with the 15-Minute City detractors as podcaster Joe Rogan relates the concern.
So a rather benign urban planning concept is shaking up the English city of Oxford, sending thousands of people into the streets to protest what they say is a dystopian plan to take away their personal freedoms and lock them into their neighborhoods. The concept of the 15-minute city, popularized by the Franco-Colombian academic Carlos Moreno, aims to make cities more livable by ensuring that all essential services, think schools, medical care, and shops, are within the distance of a short walk or bicycle ride. Broadly, the idea is to cut down on long commutes and car emissions and improve people's quality of life, ensuring they have access to quality services where they live. That's not the way it's being seen in Oxford. News of the City Council adopted a plan to embrace the 15-minute city model, prompted fierce backlash with local groups and public figures alleging that authorities plan to restrict residents to their immediate neighborhoods and strictly police their movements, which will happen eventually. The idea that that won't happen eventually, particularly in the case of a pandemic or something where they can control people, that this is not a conspiracy theory. The outrage has been fanned by popular right-wing media figures and politicians who seized on the issue as an outrageous example of government overreach. If they do limit people to those places, that is exactly what people are terrified of.
Let's just say up front that we're not arguing for making pandemic lockdowns permanent. The term 15-minute city has become corrupted and greenwashed by globalist and corporatist entities like the World Economic Forum. Let's not confuse the concept with the theory of a carbon footprint lockdown and tolls and surcharges tied to anyone who strays beyond the 15-minute city neighborhood. And there are affordability questions, political and geographic realities that make this concept maybe a boutique suggestion for wealthy hipster hoods. Point taken. Nevertheless, what we aim to do with this show is investigate what do urban theorists really mean by a 15-minute city, and it has nothing to do with locking you into your homes. The 15-minute city aims to reorganize urban space around work, home, community, and amenities. That every need is fulfilled within a 15-minute walk or a short bike ride. No more parental school traffic jams. Yes to loitering at the dog park, and getting a coffee is exempt from the to-go window line. Sure, it seems utopian, given our auto-dependent lives amid massive parking lots and keeping us focused on buying stuff and getting to work on time. And yes, this will not happen anytime soon for many or most of our sprawling suburbs. Yes, the biggest challenge of all, of course. But there is no time like the present to start changing our ways. Paris, France, is in the lead, which one might argue already is a 15-minute city for many, but the bike lanes and protected green spaces are new and revolutionary. Small and large cities and suburbs in the U.S. are also building public transit and bike lanes, engaging in traffic-calming streetscapes that favor walking, meandering, sitting, enjoying, breathing. And of course, there's the banning of onerous single-family zones in order to increase many more neighbors, and many more neighbors affording their homes, and many more neighbors living in different types of homes near new transportation modes like the bus, or how about a light rail, or how about a bike, of course. We need options. Also, making commercial uses connected with where people live is an important change to bring people closer to their favorite restaurant or tailor. Yes, this is a strategy to stop burning fossil fuels and preserve our climate stability, but it's also about creating a more functional social and spatial community/urban landscape that our car-oriented commute cities fail miserably at. Yet, we also find the detractors, a growing chorus of people who argue that this is dystopian corporate social engineering to trap us in our homes and charge us big money to go out beyond the 15-minute limits, whether it's carbon footprint personal surcharges, surveillance, activated pollution emission tax zones, pay-to-drive toll roads, congestion pricing enforced via beeping transponders to keep you immobile, or deducting funds at rush hours in order to just get to work on time. Entities like the World Economic Forum are invoked as concocting this scheme at the behest of elite oligarchs, keep you mired in bureaucracy and broke. Well, toll roads and congestion pricing are very real and controversial transportation funding instruments, but these have absolutely zero to do with the 15-minute city concept. No one wants to trap you in your 15-minute prison city. Urban planners actually argue that the present freeway culture is a form of incarceration, keeping us separated via parkways and medians, and freedom to park an expansive lot to shop at the big box is a certain form of liberty that Patrick Henry never considered from atop his galloping horse, rallying his friends to the revolution. The urban transforming 15-minute city concept was first coined by Professor Carlos Moreno, scientific director at the Sorbonne and special envoy to Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo. The 15-minute cities is part of Moreno's philosophy of Chrono-Urbanism. Okay, it's one of those terms. Be careful of urban planners. I understand, but we're going to go with Chrono-Urbanism that prioritizes planning efforts around how urban residents spend their time, essentially slowing down the pace of life. And that's in favor of humans. Not all humans agree with slowing down the pace of life, so, we've got issues. He also shares ideas for making urban areas adapt to humans, not the other way around. Well, we're going to start with Professor Carlos Moreno in his own words. He's Franco-Colombian, and his accent may be a bit hard to understand, but I thought he should explain it. And this is from a 2020 TED Talk.
For too long, those of us who live in cities, big and small, have accepted the unacceptable. We accept that in cities, our sense of time is warped because we have to waste so much of it just adapting to the absurd organization and long distances of most of today's cities. Why is it we who have to adapt and to degrade our potential quality of life? Why is it not the city that responds to our needs? Why have we left cities to develop on the wrong path for so long? I would like to offer a concept of cities that goes in the opposite direction to modern urbanism, an attempt at converging life into a human-sized space rather than fracturing it into inhuman bigness and then forcing us to adapt. I call it the 15-minute city. And in a nutshell, the idea is that cities should be designed or redesigned so that within the distance of a 15-minute walk or bike ride, people should be able to live the essence of what constitutes the urban experience. To access work, housing, food, health, education, culture, and leisure. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, why does a noisy and polluted street need to be a noisy and polluted street just because it is? Why can't it be a calm street lined with trees where people can actually meet and walk to the baker and kids can walk to school? Our acceptance of the dysfunctions and indignities of modern cities has reached a peak. We need to change that. We need to change it for the sake of justice, of our well-being, and of the climate. What do we need to create? 15-minute cities? Not only in the city center, in every vicinity, health providers, shops, artisans, markets, sports, cultural life, schools, parks. Are there green areas? Is there water fountains placed to cool off during the frequent heat waves? we also have to ask ourselves, how do we work? Why is the place I live here and work is far away? We need to rethink cities around the 4 guiding principles that are the key building blocks of the 15-minute city. First, ecology for a green and sustainable city. Second, proximity to live within reduced distance to other activities. Third, solidarity to create links between people. Finally, participation should actively involve citizens in the transformation of their neighborhood. Don't get me wrong. I'm not angling for cities to become rural hamlets. Urban life is vibrant and creative. Cities are places of economic dynamism and innovation. But we need to make urban life more pleasant, agile, healthy, and flexible. To do so, we need to make sure everyone, and I mean everyone, those living downtown and those living at the fringes, has access to all key services within proximity. How do we get this done? The first city to adopt the 15-minute city idea is Paris, France. Mayor Anne Hidalgo has suggested a big bang of proximity, which includes, for instance, a massive decentralization, developing new services for each of the districts, a reduction of traffic by increasing bike lanes into spaces of leisure, new economic models to encourage local shops, building more green spaces, transform existing infrastructure, for instance, fabrication labs in sports centers or turning schools into neighborhood centers in the evenings. That, actually, a golden rule of the 15-minute city, every square meter that's already built should be used for different things. The 15-minute city is an attempt to reconcile the city with the humans that live in it. The 15-minute city should have 3 key features. First, the rhythm of the city should follow humans, not cars. Second, each square meter should serve many different purposes. Finally, neighborhoods should be designed so that we can live, work, and thrive in them without having to constantly commute elsewhere. It's funny if you think of it. The way many modern cities are designed is often determined by the imperative to save time, and yet, so much time is lost to commuting, sitting in traffic jams, driving to a mall, in a bubble of illusory acceleration. The 15-minute city idea answers the question of saving time by turning it on its head, by suggesting a different pace of life, a 15-minute pace. Thank you.
That was Professor Carlos Moreno. So cities pump out 70% of all global carbon emissions, which means they also have the greatest opportunity to lower carbon CO2 levels and energy consumption. Climate and data scientist Angel Xu shares how cities around the world are leading the response to climate change by innovating new low-carbon ways of living. So this is also from a 2020 TED Talk. Angel Xu.
What would the world look like if extreme climate change becomes reality? Well, here's just one example. If temperatures were to rise by 3 more degrees Celsius, Shanghai, a city of 24 million people in China, will be wiped off the map. And it's not just the only coastal city that's at risk of disappearing beneath rising sea levels. Globally, 2019 was the second hottest year on record. Cities all throughout the world experienced record-setting summer temperatures. In June 2019, temperatures in Churu, India, exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, to the point that the government warned citizens to avoid drinking coffee, tea, and alcohol out of fear of overheating. Heat waves are becoming more severe and commonplace due to climate change, projected to lead to deaths at the same rate as all infectious diseases combined. By 2050, summertime highs of 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius will become the new normal in nearly 1,000 cities, triple the number of cities that currently experience these sweltering temperatures. But the irony is that cities are not just affected by climate change, they're also causing it. Cities consume between 60 and 80% of global energy resources and account for approximately 70% of global carbon dioxide emissions. Aside from cities' energy consumption, growing urban areas convert the planet's green surfaces to buildings and pavement, and these can absorb more of the sun's energy than the natural grasslands and forests that they've replaced, making urban areas hotter than their surrounding environments. This phenomenon is called the urban heat island effect. Here in Singapore, downtown neighborhoods can be as much as 7 degrees Celsius or 13 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the rainforests that were once here. While it's true that cities are contributing to climate change, they're also key actors in forging low carbon emission pathways. In dense cities like New York City and Tokyo, for instance, the average resident is responsible for over 2 tons of carbon dioxide emissions per capita. This is less than a single passenger car emits in a single year in the United States. Cities around the world are stepping up to tackle climate change with ambitious policies that often exceed the requirements of national governments. Take Copenhagen, for example. It's committed to become carbon neutral by 2025, and Glasgow in Scotland also plans to become carbon neutral by 2030. Today, there are more than 10,000 cities all around the world that are committing to their own ambitious climate actions, plans that include emissions reduction targets, clean energy and sustainable transit projects, and also energy efficiency policies that can save people and cities money, energy, and emissions. Recent analysis shows that just 6,000 cities, combined with regions and companies, are undertaking climate initiatives that can reduce global emissions by up to 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030. That's roughly 4% of the world's total annual emissions, on top of what national governments have pledged. And this is just the start. Imagine what could happen if 20,000 cities were to band together to curb climate change. While this potential for cities' climate action sounds really promising, cities must work to make sure that these policies are implemented fairly and equitably. Where you live in a city, your income, your race, research is showing that these factors can determine your access to environmental benefits like green space and sustainable transit, and they can also determine your share of environmental burdens like air pollution and climate change. We observe these neighborhood-level disparities particularly clearly in these side-by-side images of Los Angeles, comparing income on the left and tree cover on the right. The darkest green neighborhood has an average annual income of over $100,000 per person, and over 70% of it has tree cover. The blue neighborhoods towards the bottom of the map only have a third of the income per person and less than 5% tree cover. 70% versus 5%. This disparity has real consequences. Green spaces are often public spaces, and they're known to be associated with social and economic well-being. They can also reduce crime and foster social cohesion. Trees also can help to filter harmful air pollution and provide evaporative cooling and shade and relief for some of these high temperatures. So not only are those poorer neighborhoods at a greater disadvantage from access to green space, but they're also more vulnerable to air pollution and climate change. We can observe particularly pronounced disparities in urban heat according to race. Our latest research shows that 97% of major urban areas in the United States are exposing Black populations and people of color to a full degree Celsius higher of urban heat than their white counterparts. Take a look at this map of my hometown of Greenville, South Carolina. Unlike the name suggests, it is not green for everyone. The hottest areas of the county, shown on the map in red, correspond with the highest percentages of Black and poor populations. And we're seeing similar patterns throughout cities all across the United States. To address these inequalities, cities are starting to strategize and develop plans that can ensure that climate benefits are provided to all of their citizens equally. Take Bogota, the capital city of Colombia, for example. It has one of the most extensive bike networks in all of Latin America, connecting people to jobs, education centers, and recreational opportunities. A new bike highway project can allow for around 42,000 daily bicycle trips and potentially avoid 270,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. In Africa, where many cities lack universal access to electricity, mini-grids are providing approximately 73 million households with clean electricity. So as we can see from these examples, tackling climate change has to start in cities. Many cities are starting to flip the script on climate change, proving to be part of the solution and not just the problem, and bringing the kind of innovative solutions that we need for a more just and sustainable world. Thank you.
That was climate and data scientist Angel Su. Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing on all major podcast apps. Visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media for an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits. We encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to 15-Minute Cities, an Urbanist Revolution Facing Challenges. I'm your host, Jack Eidt, and we air discussions from different voices: Professor Carlos Moreno, scientist Angel Su, The Urbanity YouTube channel, and urbanist Brent Todderin on the big ideas of making our cities human-centered and the challenges we face in making those come to fruition. Now, let's approach the, shall we call them, conspiracy theories? This is a YouTube show from The Urbanity on how 15-minute city conspiracies might have it backwards.
One of the most genuinely confusing phenomena over the past few years has been the conspiracy theories surrounding 15-minute cities that have caused people to see things we advocate for, traffic calming, quality bike infrastructure, and public transit, as government control, overreach, and even tyranny. For example, we did a video on urban transformations in Montreal, covering things like the removal of a dangerous and unnecessary highway interchange here, or the addition of a pedestrian plaza in front of this school. One person commented on this video,
"They are just establishing the 15-minute prison cities where you won't be able to drive anywhere beyond your zone or will be fined."
Another person agreed,
"It's not much different from communist regimes restricting people's ability to move within the country without a permit."
Obviously, there's a lot going on here, and we're not going to be able to cover the depths of political radicalization that gets someone to say something like this. These aren't even the most extreme comments either. But what's important is that a lot of people really deeply associate cars with personal freedom. We could make a video about how we have more mobility living in an older transit-oriented neighborhood, where we can walk, bike, take transit, and yes, even drive, compared to a newer car-centric area where only one of those options is practical. We could also talk about how safety around schools and parks is a pretty profound freedom that children deserve. We could talk about the financial freedom of how little we spend on transportation most months. But we're going to take this conception of freedom at something approaching face value and argue that, even from the perspective of fearing government control and overreach, the love affair with cars and car-centric city design doesn't make a lot of sense.
Consider the fact that to drive you need a license, literally permission from the government to move around. How dystopian is that? If you don't have this permit to drive and you live in a car-centric place, you're going to be isolated with little mobility. Not only do you need a license, in most jurisdictions you need a government-approved safety inspection of your car, as well as the blessing of a private insurance company. On top of this, driving requires you to permanently display an ID number on the back of your vehicle, and in some places even on the front too. In sharp contrast to all of this, you don't need anyone's permission to walk, bike, or take transit, and you definitely don't have a permanent identification tag attached to you. Now, these requirements on driving obviously make sense. You're operating a potentially very dangerous machine. Of course you're going to be licensed, insured, and tagged. We're not saying this is government overreach, but it's definitely government control. And that makes it confusing that driving is seen as this ultimate expression of liberty.
Cars these days are also a disaster for data and privacy. Wiretaps on wheels, according to one report. In another privacy bombshell, Mozilla reviewed 25 car brands and found that cars are the worst category of products for privacy that they've ever reviewed, with modern cars having unmatched power to watch, listen, and collect information about what you do and where you go. All 25 brands collect more data than necessary, Most sell or share your data with service providers, data brokers, and other businesses. And more than half share your data with law enforcement in response to a request, not even necessarily a court order. This is hidden behind opaque privacy policies with limited ability to opt out. In a car-centric city, the only way around this is to buy an old car, but that's less practical every year. If you can walk, bike, or take transit, on the other hand, it's a lot easier to opt out of this surveillance apparatus.
Driving a motor vehicle also subjects you to a bunch of other legal requirements. Papers, please. It depends where you live, but drivers are typically required to show ID and documents to police, in a way that pedestrians and even passengers are not, unless there's a specific crime being suspected or accused. You're also not allowed to drive after drinking alcohol or smoking legal marijuana. Obviously an extremely sensible policy that no one should question, but those are rules that you can be free to not care about, if you have the option to walk or take transit. The rules about cycling depend on where you live, but in Canada, intoxicated driving applies only to motor vehicles, not to bikes. Don't be reckless, but you rightfully have more freedom on a bike than in a car.
On top of being a generally expensive way to get around, driving also makes you sensitive to gas prices and dependent on oil companies and foreign cartels who manipulate the market. These trains here are powered by local electricity from hydroelectric dams. They don't give a damn about gas prices. Cities built to encourage driving also typically rely on a lot of the government micromanaging what you can do with your own property in order to keep driving practical. Anyone who's tried to drive in a big city can tell you that driving doesn't work very well to move large numbers of people. So local governments strictly regulate density and where people can live to avoid the omnipresent menace of traffic congestion. They also mandate that stores overbuild parking lots based on arbitrary rules and a fixation on having enough parking for the busiest shopping days of the year, regardless of what the stores actually want to build.
We're not going to pretend like the conspiracy theories around 15-minute cities are a normal belief that we can rationalize most people out of. We normally believe in the power of discussion and argumentation. But at the same time, it's obvious that anyone who responds to a video on urban transformations in Montreal by talking about so-called prison cities is just on a different planet when it comes to our fundamental understanding of reality. But it's genuinely fascinating that people can use a fear of government control to argue for car-centric cities. You're going to resist the government by supporting and prioritizing the one transportation mode that relies on government licenses and identification tags? Subjects you to all sorts of extra rules about impairment and identifying yourself to the police? Makes you dependent on oil companies and authoritarian oil cartels? Requires strict regulation of where people can live? And gives up even more of your data than a smart home assistant. This makes no sense.
That was Oh the Urbanity on YouTube. Next, let's go to Brent Todderan, a renowned Canadian urbanist and city planner who shares his insights and experiences in shaping vibrant cities with the city of Mississauga, Ontario, and this is also from YouTube.
Working in almost every continent and in some of the best and worst cities in the world. The difference isn't any of the excuses, any of the conditions that are brought up. It's whether or not you let those excuses get in the way and whether you have leadership and will to actually do better things. Another example of my constructive candor, this is a tweet that was put out after it was announced that I was coming. This person has been hired by City Manager Sherry Lichterman to consult for a car-free Mississauga. No, I haven't. There is no car-free Mississauga being discussed here. How much taxpayer monies have gone to it? Well, you can FOIP that. It's public knowledge. Car drivers, he recommends buying a cart or a shopping trolley to walk to the grocery store. Yes, I do that. But I don't if you're miles and miles and miles away from the grocery store. That's kind of the problem. I hope for a balanced approach and not a zero-car policy. Well, I get a lot of comments when it's public knowledge that I'm coming to town. These are some of the nicer ones, frankly. And what I'll say to you is, no, there's nothing here about being anti-car. But I am very anti-car dependency. And I am going to be, and have already been, challenging your city about providing more choice, more options, more freedom. There is no banning of the car in this conversation. The war on the car is a lazy narrative by ultra-right-wing politicians who want to scare you and make you mad, or media that wants to get clicks. There is nothing here that is anti-car. But everything I say is proven with a business case and pro-better city. That has been proven to allow cities to succeed better for everyone, including drivers. And I'll get back to that. This is the appropriate word to start any conversation about the state of cities these days. Crisis. I'm a city planner. I was trained to be patient. That's literally what my education was about. We make a plan and then we wait, patiently, hopefully, for the plan to be realized over time. Well, we don't have all the time in the world. Urgency and, yes, crisis are the important words in city building these days. And I talk about the 5 crises in current global city building. The climate crisis, which I hope to God I don't have to explain to you. The housing crisis, which I hope to God I don't have to explain to you. The inequality, racism, and classism, and exclusivity of neighborhoods or inclusivity of neighborhoods crisis that plays out in how we've been designing and zoning and planning cities since there's been planning. The public health crisis that's tied pre-pandemic, tied to how we've been designing preventable diseases, obesity, into our society by designing out physical activity through car dependency, etc. We've been in a public health crisis tied to the way we build cities, and particularly suburbs, for decades before the pandemic came along. An infrastructure cost crisis that plays out every single time your council or any other council is having a conversation about potentially double-digit tax increases because of the absolutely brutal per capita infrastructure costs associated with car-dependent suburbs. It is bankrupting, or at least handcuffing financially, cities all over North America. And we're not connecting the dots enough to that, but it is an infrastructure cost crisis, not an infrastructure crisis. We can build the infrastructure for growth. We're just building growth, have been at least in the suburbs, in the most expensive way in human history by far. I commented back a number of years ago, a number of the GTA's top public health officers, the top doctors, got together and did a press conference about how we needed more walkable communities, transit-supportive communities, as preventative, upfront health, public health. And that this would be the smartest thing we could do to improve our public health and reduce our public health care costs, which I don't need to tell you are substantial, if not crippling. And I joked that if the chief planners of the regions held a press conference, the media wouldn't have come. But at that time, at least, pre-pandemic, public health officers were pretty cool people who got a lot of respect. Now it's a little occasionally different. There's some folks who don't like them. But back then, the doctors were probably our best allies in having a public conversation about how we've been building our cities and our suburbs. And it's important to have those allies. I actually, at the time, was hired by the Health Foundation of Australia, who hired me with their discretionary money to bring a Canadian planner to come down and talk to 5 states and city regions in Australia about public health through better city planning and urban design. And they put out this document called Does Density Matter? It's still online, you can Google it, but I'll give away the ending. Yes, density matters substantially to our public health. So there's a connecting of the dots that needs to be done. If you're not motivated by that or climate change or the housing, maybe money motivates you. Canada is actually the world leader in doing cost of growth analysis that shows how much more it costs to build car-dependent suburbs than it does to build walkable, transit-friendly infill. And once you've done this kind of study, I say it's like a bell that you can't unring. HRM, Halifax Regional Municipality, had this on the front page of their newspaper. They just did a study to see if we just changed the ratio a bit of growth in their new plan from greenfield to infill, just by 10 or 20%, $3 billion of difference over the life of the plan. And that was done by Stantec, which is a pretty conservative, frankly, consulting firm. So I suspect the number is actually higher. So every city I know of is struggling to pay for more with less. So the way we've been building is probably the single most important issue a city can change in order to lower your taxes and to do more in terms of your services and quality of life provision with less of your public money. So even if you don't care about any of those things I talked about and you just want your taxes low, the business case for everything I say is rock solid. Here's one of the challenges. When I come to work for cities, I don't give my vision. I look at the vision that the city has already stated. I find it. Sometimes it's sitting in a drawer collecting dust. But I look for it and I find it, and then I say, did you mean it? What would it take to actually achieve it? And by the way, what you're doing isn't going to get you there. So when I started working for Guelph, their target was to cut emissions in half by 2030. That's only 8 years from when I started working for them. So my question was, what would it really take, to reach a 63% reduction in per capita emissions by 2030? The bad news is my conclusion was, looking at all of their goals and policies and rules, etc., that they would be lucky to get there by 2050, and they probably wouldn't get there at all, based on what they were actually doing. There was a fundamental disconnect between what they claimed their vision was and what they were actually doing to make it happen. If you think the technology is going to save us because there isn't the kind of significant action from City Hall, bad news, the technology isn't going to save us. Driverless cars very well may end up, if it ever happens, and I've sat on many panels and stages with the actual developers of the technology, and I'm doubtful it'll happen even within my lifetime, based on what they say, not what I say. Even if it does succeed, if those are not a shared fleet, it will end up with more cars on the road driving even more. And electric cars are a positive benefit. I am not against electric cars. What I'm against is leaders saying all we need to do is convert the fleet of existing cars in our cities to electric and we're done. Mission accomplished. It's not enough. Even these studies that have already been done shows that only gets us about a third of the climate reductions that we actually need to get to address climate change, to keep it below the temperature rise that we know we need. And that's just on the climate side of the issue. There are all sorts of reasons to reduce the number of cars that doesn't have to do with whether or not there's a tailpipe. So the technology is not going to save us. And bad news if you're an Elon Musk fan, but tunnels for Teslas isn't going to save us either. I took some heat by saying that idea when he announced it was dumb and dangerous, so Elon he blocked me on Twitter. And then he unblocked me. A few years later, I actually had some conversations with his chief of staff about using that technology for transit instead of cars. So he unblocked me, and then he bought Twitter and started screwing it up, so I blocked him. These solutions are distractions. The reason they are a problem is I can't tell you how many times I've heard a mayor say to me, it's good news we don't have to invest in transit because this is the solution. They're not just a little distraction, they're a bad distraction. And some of it is purposeful. What I said to Wired magazine when they asked me to comment about Masdar, which is the gizmo green community in the United Arab Emirates. New technology can be advantageous, but it doesn't replace compact, walkable, complete communities and a good, very simple, basic relationship between housing and employment. The fundamentals. The fundamentals come from density, from use mix, and transportation infrastructure. 3 simple things that we know how to do better, we're just not. If you really want to talk about green, it's about how we think about every element of our city building, every single aspect. It's not about a line in your strategy about green technology or green building or green cars. It's how we get all the fundamentals right. And I have friends who do great, remarkable constructs about green cities with every element, and I try to keep it simple in the context of conversations like this. If I want to know if your city hall is green, if your city planning is green, I look at how you're treating your density, how you're treating your trees, and how you're treating your cars. And I can tell everything I need to know about if you're green or not by how you treat those things. So let's talk about those things. I've been calling it for many years, density done well. We need to achieve more density, but it's not just throwing it up. It's not doing it badly. There's a lot of density out there. But there are fundamental, easy ways to do it well, and if you do it well, you get all these public benefits. I actually started using this slide when I first became chief planner of Vancouver. I went around neighborhood to neighborhood talking about why we needed to densify and why the public interest is supported by density, not developer profit, because the narrative was, well, if we're talking about density, you must be in the pockets of a developer, because that's just about developer profit. No, these are the public interest reasons why city halls need to be talking, frankly, much better than they do about density. And I've been using this same slide since then. That was 2006. I watch with great consternation. In some cases, I'm happy. I'm not sure how to feel about it. This growing divide, it's kind of like the right and the left in American politics. The divide between the so-called NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and the so-called YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard, increasingly polarizing. And everyone in the middle who doesn't understand, isn't sure where to fall on this range. I tend to talk about Quimby, and when I'm saying that, I'm not talking about Mayor Quimby on The Simpsons. I'm talking about quality in my backyard. We need a conversation that, yes, promotes density in housing, but does not jettison the conversation about quality. And that's, in its worst moments, what YIMBY does. And I don't blame them for that, because they often say that the conversation about quality is just a Trojan horse to say no to housing, because it's never good enough. And I get that. But sophisticated cities can have a conversation about quality without saying no. It's about how.
That was Brent Toderen, Canadian urbanist and city planner. Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. Stay connected by subscribing on all major podcast apps. Visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media for an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits. We encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to 15-Minute Cities, an Urbanist Revolution Facing Challenges. I'm your host, Jack Eidt, and we air discussions from different voices: Professor Carlos Moreno, scientist Angel Su, The Urbanity YouTube channel, and urbanist Brent Toderen, on the big ideas of making our cities human-centered and the challenges we face in making those come to fruition. And finally, Brent Toderen, a renowned Canadian urbanist and city planner.
So I talk about density done well at every scale and not having scale dogma, as I call it. I have no time for urbanists and architects who are so fixated on human scale, which is an important aspect in urban design, that, well, there's one famous architect who says there's a special level of hell dedicated to architects who design buildings over 6 floors. That kind of dogma is not helping the discourse about how we address our challenges as cities. So every scale done better. I have no fear of heights. I want cities to embrace heights in the right way, in the right places, be clear about where height is not allowed, be clear with your expectations about how to do it well, do your mid-rise really well. This is our Olympic Village, which we built in time for the 2010 Winter Games. This was in 2010 named the greenest community in North America. I'm embarrassed that 14 years later it still has the most LEED ND points ever bestowed. Of course, we've moved on a bit from LEED, but there should have been a lot more communities that have surpassed it by now, and still technically on paper the greenest. And that's a problem. And then how we densify our neighborhoods beyond the transit areas, beyond the transit corridors, in the neighborhoods. I don't need to tell you that there's been some awfully big moves recently, both at the provincial scale and in the context of the Housing Accelerator Fund, and cities like yours doing more to essentially get rid of that concept of single-family zoning. Because when I was talking about this in 2007 as chief planner of Vancouver, which was a long time ago, I made up terms like gentle, hidden, and invisible density to have a conversation with the communities about how you could add housing types and it would actually stabilize your neighborhood, not change it. There's no such thing as the concept of stable neighborhoods, despite what the City of Toronto plan has in its wording. Stable neighborhoods are a mythology. You cannot stop change. And when you're actually prohibiting housing types, it's the opposite of stabilization, because you have fewer people per household, the kids are moving out, and the houses aren't turning over. So your school is under threat of closure, your local school. And boy, the school boards would like to close those anyway, because they want regional scale schools that everybody has to drive to. Your local retailing, the things you can walk to theoretically in your neighborhood, are under threat of closure because there isn't enough population support. Does any of that sound stable to you? So you can actually have a conversation about adding housing types and actually stabilize your neighborhoods. And by the way, the aging parents who have the large house now may potentially have the opportunity to downsize in their neighborhood, which they want to do, but they don't want to leave their neighborhoods, so they stay in the big house. And maybe they could give their kids and the grandkids the original house so that they stay in the neighborhood and they don't have to drive out far to the suburbs to see your grandkids. I have heard so many conversations about how change in your neighborhood can be a good thing, which is very different than to just, no, change is bad. I don't want any different housing types in my neighborhood because I like my quality of life exactly the way it was when I moved in. So in Vancouver, we brought in laneway housing. This was my hidden density because it was tucked in behind. Invisible density were secondary suites, which we allowed as of right in 2004 in Vancouver. We brought in laneway housing on top of that in 2007. The type of housing that there is now angst in the community about in Mississauga, Vancouver has allowed for 15 or 16 years. And Vancouver is doing okay in terms of livability. It's very expensive, but the livability hasn't been in question. So you're now getting to a point where you're having the conversations about change in neighborhoods that other cities have been in for a long time. Vancouver, we have probably about 10,000 laneway houses actually approved. So this has been going on for a while. So I use the term gentle density. My friend Daniel Perolik in California came up with a better brand, the missing middle. You probably heard that, missing middle housing. I like that better, and it's frankly being used a lot, but both terms are good. Gentle suggests that it's relatively low impact, doesn't change really the nature and scale of the community. Missing middle emphasizes the fact that it's not there. We haven't been building it. So we have either single detached homes or high mid-rise. And we were missing a whole opportunity to provide housing choice in our neighborhoods. So tall buildings. Tall buildings aren't just a downtown thing. And there is a lot of dogma about tall buildings, a lot of fear, because there is what I call a fear of heights. A lot of objectors to tall buildings refer to what I often hear as vertical sprawl. Oh, it's a bad thing. It's like a cul-de-sac in the sky. And what I say is, that's bullshit. There is such a thing as vertical sprawl. That's when you build tall buildings out in the suburbs in a car-dependent place with no public transit, where you ride down the elevator, which is a form of public transit, I often say, and go into the parking garage and vomit out onto the expressway. It's car-dependent tall buildings. That is vertical sprawl. But some people use that term to reference any tall building, which is wrong. If you ride down the elevator like I do every day in downtown Vancouver, and walk my kids to school, walk to the grocery store, 3 within 2 blocks that I can choose from, walk to anything, or take public transit or ride my bike, that is vertical urbanism. There is nothing sprawl about that. So there is a difference. Are you, just because you're doing tall buildings, are you building vertical sprawl or vertical urbanism? Let's at least be accurate and precise. But there's too much dogma around what I call the Montparnasse effect. This is the Montparnasse Tower in Paris. It is the reason why no tall buildings were in central Paris. They built this. It casts shadow. Not only is it ugly, it casts shadow directly on Montparnasse Cemetery, which is one of the most beloved spaces in Paris. So I call it the middle finger to Parisians. It's the reason why Paris said no tall buildings for a long time. And if you allow tall buildings like this, council is going to say no more. The people are going to say no more. I often say if this is what I was going to get in Vancouver, I would have said no more. But you don't have to have it that way. When I was hired by Kingston, tall buildings were one of the most contentious issues. They asked me what I thought about addressing the height in these buildings. These were the tall buildings they were building in Kingston. And I said I can name 10 things that are awful about these buildings without even talking about height. And yet the public discourse was just, well, how many floors are they proposing? Oh, that's too many. So that's bad design. We are myopically fixated on height, when what we should be fixated on is quality of design and growth. I advised the city of Helsinki, Finland for a while. The picture in the bottom, right here, was a proposal for tall buildings. I don't know if this is working. The picture in the bottom, and they asked me to peer review it. We did a workshop, and I took them through all the things that were wrong with the proposal and didn't mention height, and said, you can turn this into it's, by the way, this is right on the second station for the rail, heavy rail, passenger rail. So a very urban place, second only to the central station right downtown. So they wanted density, they wanted urbanism, but they were deathly afraid of height, like many European cities started off as. So I gave them a whole bunch of advice which they didn't follow, and they ended up approving this building in the back. And they were happy because they managed to get the height down a bit. But it is the most packed. When you walk in there, you feel like you're like this. And they made it worse. When they could have made the tall towers associated with a street, having a street presence, having active uses at grade, all the things that would make tall buildings good design, like we do in Vancouver, for example. But instead, they made the density about as worse as they can get, all because they were absolutely fixated on how many floors were being proposed. So European cities get this bad too, or wrong too. But it might interest you to know that most of those European cities have been hiring me lately to help them with a different approach to tall buildings, such as Oslo, Norway, and I'll get to that in a minute. In Vancouver, I said I won't talk all about Vancouver, but I am going to reference it occasionally. In Vancouver, the attitude that long predated me was that height is just a design challenge. And if you do it well with tower separation and thin towers and podiums that create a human scale and stepping back of the towers so that the human scale is established by the podium, the height provides the body heat and density where you can ride down the elevator like a public transit system and activate your neighborhood with vibrancy that comes from people. This works. This is good urbanism. This is how you do tall buildings. And this is how those buildings land. They land with generous giving, generous granting of quality to the walker, rewarding the walker for doing something that's sustainable and healthy, essentially, by always providing a quality walking experience, not just in the horizontal. You see wide sidewalks, double rows of trees, which is quite common in Vancouver, a clear differentiation of private, semi-private, and public space through an elevated change in grade. All the things that make at-grade housing units give life and eyes on the street to make a successful public realm. So careful design, but always active things at grade. The number one urban design principle in Vancouver urbanism, no blank walls. 3 words, no blank walls. And when you're activating the street, you're essentially rewarding people enough that they actually slow down and enjoy the street. When I talk to traffic engineers who are enlightened and realize that streets aren't about moving cars, they're about moving people, they still tend to think about moving pedestrians. And I say the definition of success is when you actually slow down pedestrians, what I call sticky streets, which isn't about gum on your shoe, it's about slowing down the pedestrians so they're actually enjoying the street, their neighbors, etc. One of my heroes, Jonathan Barnett, many of you who are city planners or urbanists would know him, said it's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense. He's actually wrong. It's both. It is how dense you make it. It matters how dense you make it. Density is just a technical word for homes in a housing crisis. We need more density and we need to challenge our own comfort levels, including our urban design comfort levels, to achieve more housing and a lower carbon footprint per capita. So it matters how dense it is, but it definitely matters how dense you make it. And when it comes to height, this is what I say. It's not just how tall you make it, but how you make it tall. When I advised Oslo on their new tall building strategy, these were all the conditions we built into the approach. But the point is only one of these is height. The rest of them are other things. If you want your tall towers in your urban places to have families, which is a specific policy consideration, because many downtowns have kind of given up on families. Many city halls have given up on them in their downtowns and urban places. But if you want households with kids in your downtown, Vancouver has 7,000 kids in our downtown peninsula, and coming on to 4 elementary schools. Then you need 3 things. You need family-sized housing, and you probably need to mandate it. That's 2 and 3 bedroom minimum units. You need some of them, 20, 30%. You need households that can actually fit families. You need kids-supporting amenities, daycare, schools, and supports. Or else you may be able to fit the families, but then what happens when they have to drive out of the downtown to go to their daycare or go to their schools? And you need to design the public realm for kids. In that order, housing is the deal breaker. It's game over if you don't build units with more than one. By the way, I hate the word units, so I shouldn't have said it out loud. These are homes. Never call them units. Call them apartments if you want. They are homes. If you don't have family-sized homes, it's game over. But then you have to do the other things too. So I'm doing downtown housing strategies, including with Sacramento, California right now. This is what we're building, because we want more housing, not just for adults and double income, no kids, or seniors or singles, but families. Trees. I'm not a tree hugger. I don't talk about trees because I'm going to read a poem. I am extremely practical about trees. Trees are essential infrastructure for good city making. They are one of the smartest investments any city can make. The sheer number of public interests that trees support, over and above just whether you like them or not, is significant. The return on investment, the value creation is staggering. It is colossally stupid that we do such a bad job with trees in cities. And that's a pragmatic thing to say. I'm talking from the business case perspective. There are so many reasons to do it. So it's not just that I like to show pictures of streets with trees. This is the easy place to do trees because it's in the public realm along the paths. This is the seawall and other places in Vancouver. This is the streets, as I told you, the double row of trees. This is one of my favorites right in my neighborhood. There's actually 4 rows of trees on each side. One next to the curb, one in the yard, one in the upper yard, and there's actually trees on the unit tops. So the canopy that's created, the change in microclimate, this is my kids' favorite street. When they walk in, it immediately cools down. This is important in a warming climate for warming cities where there's such a thing now as the heat dome effect and people actually dying. But that's only about 1 of 20 reasons why trees are a good investment. So can we please stop talking about trees like it's something that tree huggers want? I'm not being dismissive to tree huggers. I'm making the point that that's how it's often characterized in City Hall, where trees get an eye roll, frankly. They should be an incredibly pragmatic thing for cities to champion. This is even, by the way, courtyards are a very good thing for density and development. This is our courtyard in my building. This is the interior above grade on the top of the 3rd floor, on top of the parking, podium courtyard, which has this, again, kind of canopy. So that's trees. Let's talk about the last one, cars. I could do 45 minutes just on cars. And as I said, this is not an anti-car message, but there needs to be a fundamental change in the way we've surrendered our priorities, surrendered our physical space in cities to almost cars only. And it's not really just cars we're talking about anymore. We all tend to use cars as a short form for all the vehicles. Increasingly, what we're talking about is SUVs and trucks, pickup trucks. Bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's actually erased most of the benefits of the greening of the vehicle technology. Emissions are actually going up, not down, despite the improvements in green technology over time, because SUVs are so much heavier, trucks are even heavier than that. It's erasing the advantage. It's actually called Jevons paradox. When we think something is green, we end up using it more. We buy more vehicles and we drive them further because they're green, and our emissions actually end up going up. And that's before talking about things like the explosions in pedestrian deaths that have to do with not only vehicle speeds, but vehicle size, etc. When I'm talking about cars, I am going to talk about infrastructure for transportation, but I always start with this point. The best transportation plan is a great land use plan. If you actually do your density right, it gets you about 70% of the way there to solving your transportation problems. The infrastructure is the last 30%. But if you've got good infrastructure that connects nothing with nothing in low-density sprawl, you're not going to get shift from cars to walking, biking, and transit. So never forget, the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. Also, you're not going to solve the problem through adding more lanes. I hope I don't need to explain this. Since 1955, when Lewis Mumford said this, we really should have understood it by now. Adding car lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. We will never solve traffic congestion with more lanes. It's called induced demand or induced traffic. It just induces more driving and more sprawl and more car dependency. The only way you really address traffic congestion is by building other ways of getting around and combined with pricing mechanisms. Those are the only ways you will actually have fewer vehicles in your lanes. But the real goal is to move more people, but not with more cars. What we need are complete streets where we are balancing different modes. I don't even like the word balancing. Don't forget that word. What we're trying to do is move more people with fewer cars, more people in the same or even less space. And an example of that are my clients in Oslo. They buried the highway that was disconnecting the downtown with the fjord to build their fjord city concept. Best waterfront transformation of any city in the world. If you haven't been to Oslo, you should go. But the interesting thing about this is underneath what I'm showing you now is the now buried freeway. They still move a lot of cars there, but they actually move more people in the multimodal boulevard than they did before on the freeway in cars. They move more people in cars and buses, bus-only lanes, tram, and bike lanes. They move more people each day on this. And it took a fraction of the space. The rest of the space, they built office space, housing, a community center, a certain portion of the Oslo Opera House, if you know that iconic building, all because they buried the freeway. So not only did they build this great community, they're actually moving more people. As soon as you realize that the job of transportation in cities is not to move cars, but to move people, then you know that we can move more people with less space, with less public cost, with better public health. Any way you measure success rationally in a city, You can move more as soon as you remember that the job isn't to just move cars. It's to move people. So our goal as cities grow in people, we need fewer cars. More people, less cars, fewer cars. Less driving, more choices, better communities, and stronger cities. That is the math of more successful cities. We need to prioritize, reprioritize the way we've been organizing our space, our budgets, etc. Not cars first, second, and third, and then everything else. But walking, biking, transit, goods movement, and then the private car. We don't ban the car, we just prioritize it last. City after city is putting this into their policies now. I've helped a number of cities do it. This is Medellin, Colombia, where we put it into both the transportation plan and the new land use plan. Budget is particularly important because you can claim to reprioritize space, but often the truth is where you're putting your money. I often say the truth about a city's aspirations isn't found in its vision statement, it's found in its budget. So when we're talking about bikes, this is not a cars versus bikes battle, but if you want more bikes, bike riding, more trips by bike, the only answer, the only way we'll achieve that is separated, protected bike share. Full stop, period. Paint is not infrastructure. Painted bike lanes do not make, studies have shown, do not make bike riding safer. And sharrows actually make bike riding more dangerous. If you want people, rational people who aren't the hard chargers who will go in fundamentally unsafe conditions, if you want any other rational people to want to take the bike as a mode of transportation, not as a mode of recreation, separated, protected bike network, a minimum grid, and you build it fast. Not one bike lane at a time, pulling the Band-Aid off slowly, probably forcing yourself into a scenario of bad politics every year. Why aren't there more people using the bike lane we just built? Well, because you have one bike lane. You don't have a minimum grid. You don't have a connected system. You're never going to get more mode share until you've built enough and built it well, and then maintain it well when it snows, etc., in the winter. So if you want this, then do it right. This is Vancouver's approach, all ages and abilities, AAA. It starts with basic separation and protection, but it's more than just that. It's width, it's orientation, etc. If you want people to switch, do it right. And if you think, well, that's Vancouver, this is Calgary, where I planned before Vancouver. This is the best bike pilot that's been done in North America. A minimum grid, protected bike system in downtown Calgary. They barely got it passed as a pilot, and by the time the pilot was finished, in Calgary, they got a unanimous vote by council to make it perfect, because they showed that it wasn't Carmageddon, and people actually used it when you provided a minimum grid. And this is Calgary, for God's sakes. If Calgary can do it, why can't you? And when Edmonton copied Calgary, because the Battle of Alberta isn't just about hockey, when they copied, because they didn't like all the attention that Calgary was getting, they said, we won't even do a pilot, we'll just do it, which was good for them. Calgary and Edmonton have both done it now. Why can't you? This isn't about cars versus bikes. As I've said, that's just a narrative to get clicks and angry voters. This is about how we have been prioritizing our space, because this is the truth. We've surrendered so much space to not even the driver. The driver doesn't take up much space at all. It's the car that takes up space.
That was Brent Toderen, Canadian urbanist and city planner. Thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been 15-Minute Cities, an urbanist revolution facing challenges. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at EcoJusticeRadio, SoCal350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard, you want others to be informed, subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show. The project of SoCal 350, the show can be found on KPFK, KPFT, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer and host, myself, Jack Eidt, co-host Jessica Aldridge, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.